Hey, have you ever been trying to play your favorite uh a trading card game, Yu-Gi-Oh? And in the middle of it, you saw a card like this? What is this? What is this? Cyberse Clock Dragon, Cyberse Fusion effect, Clock Wyvern plus one plus link monsters. And what is all this? What is look at all this goddamn text. What does this mean? Yu-Gi-Oh has too much text, and what to do about it is the name of this presentation. So, what's the problem? Well, over time, Yu-Gi-Oh card effects have become increasingly complex, and you see this with pretty much every game that runs for a long period of time. Designers kind of want to make more complex effects or mechanics, and that has to do with their own creative ambitions as well as financial ones. Like they want to create interesting cards and strong cards that people will want to buy. So naturally, you're going to see this kind of like, I don't know, complexity creep occur across every game. But Yu-Gi-Oh has this especially bad because the amount of text ends up making the game particularly difficult for players of all skill levels, and I'll get to that in a second. I'm not talking about like a rules level, like most players know the basic rules, but it's more like the moment to moment gameplay of a game of Yu-Gi-Oh often has even experienced players picking up their opponent's cards just to read them and reread them and make sure that they understand exactly what's going on. And with so many cards, it makes it basically impossible to have everything memorized. And this gets especially so with cards that are more niche or are older. And it turns into a big headache. So let's take a look at an example of cards from various eras of Yu-Gi-Oh! So let's look at an old Yu-Gi-Oh! Card. Mystic Tomato, classic. I love Mystic Tomato. So a little bit of text. Okay, when it's destroyed by battle, sent to the graveyard, special summon a dark monster with some amount of attack, face up attack position. Okay, not the okay. There's some like interactions and things happening. You got to understand a bit about the game, but it's not too much, right? It's not a crazy effect. You can read that and basically compartmentalize that. Let's look at a card from a few years later. Dark Lord Desire. So a little bit more text, but if you look at it, a lot of it is like the summoning conditions, right? Um, Summoning conditions actually take up a lot of space on the card text, almost half of it, and then its actual last half is um, the actual ability of the card. But again, like not super complex. You gotta like a summoning condition, and then an ability, and the ability itself isn't that hard to understand. Um, Now let's look at fucking Endymion, the mighty master of magic. So like some of this is due to the fact that Endymion is a pendulum monster, which means that he can be played as a spell as well as a monster. And he has different effects for both. But like even without that, I just look at the monster effect text. That's insane. This is something that I call text debt. So, what is text debt? Text debt. Debt. It is a knock-on effect of the way that Yu-Gi-Oh is designed. Specifically, the a choice that they made very early on in the game's life to essentially favor absolute grammatical clarity when writing card text. They write out every single effect, no matter how common it is, it gets written out in full. Now, this is counter to the way that other games will approach this, many other card games that you'll pick up, where they will liberally employ keywords, and we'll explain what that means. So, with an example of Yu-Gi-Oh versus Magic the Gathering, two of the most prime card games on the market. So, this is a card for Magic the Gathering, attracts a Praetor's Voice. And now I want you to realize that this is a card that's been criticized for having too much going on. Okay, this is a card that has been criticized by some people for having a little too much going on in the text. It has flying, vigilance, death touch, lifelink, and at the beginning of your end step, proliferate, which is a little explainer for what that is. Choose any number of permanents and or players, give another counter of each kind already there. So this card seems to have a lot of mechanics. Every single one of these: flying, vigilance, death touch, lifelink, proliferate. These are all keywords. These are all keyworded mechanics. Ideas that have been wrapped into a single word. And again, this is a card which has been considered pretty beefy. Like, it has a little too much going on, but I took it upon myself to, let's just, for instance, try and rewrite it in the style of a Yu-Gi-Oh card. This isn't going to be perfect. It's not going to be one-to-one, but I think it demonstrates my point. So I would rewrite it as, this monster cannot be blocked except by monsters with the same effect. After attacking, this monster is not tapped. Any monster this monster attacks is destroyed. After this monster attacks, restore LP to its owner equal to its attack. At the beginning of the end phase, choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. So as you can see, just from this one example, it is significantly more wordy. About roughly half of the text is just spent on all of these things, which are basically summarized in these keywords. So for me, when I look at Atraxa Praetor's voice, I can very quickly just 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I can actually pay attention to the last line, or where everything else basically about proliferating and how that works. And that's like the important part of the card. With rewriting it in like a Yu-Gi-Oh style, and again, this isn't one-to-one. I'm not sure this would be exactly how it would be written. There's flying doesn't have an exact a good one-to-one comparison between games, but that's like, imagine I was writing this for Magic. This is like much harder to just parse in general. Like, there's so much that has to be pulled apart just to get to what does this card actually do. It is the Yu-Gi-Oh version that I've written up is 64 words versus 11 of the original. Like, the whole game of Yu-Gi-Oh is shackled with this, and it gets worse because the more complex the cards are, the more headache-inducing the amount of text becomes. Now, a few years ago, they introduced problem-solving card text, which was meant to solve issues that they were already identifying, and it kind of does, but it's more of like a band-aid fix than anything really substantial. And the root of the problem that problem-solving card text is only kind of addressing is that Yu-Gi-Oh's style of writing its card text does not scale well. So like in this previous example with Atraxa, when I say text debt, I mean the way that Yu-Gi-Oh is forced to write out its card text, it ends up basically weighing down and distracting from what they actually want the card to be focused on. So for instance, here, they want proliferate. Magic will usually write out the names of, they'll write out a description of a mechanic that they kind of want to introduce into the set, or they want to make sort of unique, that it hasn't been super established already. So like the proliferate, all that at the beginning of your end step, proliferate, the whole explanation, that is all for that's like supposed to be a memorable part of the card. That's like a key part of the card. The other stuff is just all of these essentially other little bonuses that are being tacked onto the card to be strong, essentially, to make it stronger. These little things that are tacked on, they're obviously they're important. A lot of these things are powerful abilities, but in terms of what the designer's trying to communicate to the player, being able to wrap those all into keywords means that you can actually kind of put more focus on the mechanic you're trying to introduce, or communicate to the player, which is the proliferate one in this case. So here's two examples of some of the problems with the way that Yu-Gi-Oh goes about writing its text. we're going to compare Spellbook of Secrets to another card called Lone Fire Blossom. Now, if you look at each of these, Spellbook of Secrets, essentially what it does, you play it, and you can take, it lets you take a Spellbook card from your deck, add it to your hand, and you can activate it once per turn. All right. Lone Fire Blossom does something kind of similar. Basically, you can sacrifice one kind of monster to get another monster onto the field. Summon it from your deck. So, and that is also a once per turn effect. So you're like, okay, what's the, besides the fact that, you know, these cards are sort of doing, one's taking a like a spellbook card, like besides these like very specific things, a lot of these cards kind of doing similar things, except no, they're not, because you read this, and these cards actually play extremely differently and have very different implications in the way that they can be played. And the reason is because Spellbook of Secrets says it can only be played once per turn. Lone Fire Blossom also says it can only be played once per turn, except that's actually not true. You can use the effect multiple times per turn. The once per turn is not a real once per turn, and that's because there are two types of once per turn in Yu-Gi-Oh! A hard and a soft once per turn. And the way you distinguish them is that Spellbook of Secrets has only in its sentence with the once per turn, and Lone Fire Blossom does not. So what that means is when I play Spellbook of Secrets, that is the only Spellbook of Secrets I can activate that turn. I can't play it again or anything like that. I can't repeat the effect. Lone Fire Blossom, I could have 3 Lone Fire Blossoms on the field, and I could use each one's effect, but I can only use each one individually one time. And this is really important for like decks that focus on certain combos. Even like an experienced player, or not an experienced player, but like an intermediate player who kind of like has a better grasp of the game's mechanics, can really easily get confused by the difference in just one word, and also the fact that hard once per turn clauses tend to be at the end of a card text, but soft once per turn tend to be at like the beginning. And like to most people, they would read these and assume that they work the same way, but they don't, and it actually has pretty wide implications on the way that they're played. Here's another really fun example, a little thing that exists in Yu-Gi-Oh! Called missing timing. So now I got these two cards for an example from ygopro.com. They have an article about this topic. So what is missing the timing? Well, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of cards that have effects which activate based off of something else happening. So if we look at Peten the Dark Clown, you can see that it has an effect that activates when it's sent to the graveyard. Okay? When it's sent to the graveyard. Perform Age Trick Clown has an effect that activates if it's sent to your graveyard. So these would activate the same way. No, they don't. See, all right, so Perform Age Trick Clown, when it's sent to the graveyard, will always activate its effect. Peten the Dark Clown may not, and the reason for it is one word. It's because it says when it's sent to the graveyard and not if it's sent to the graveyard. That's the difference. The reason for that is because when certain effects activate or resolve in Yu-Gi-Oh!, multiple actions can happen in essentially one step simultaneously. Or not simultaneously, but apart from each other. It's the opposite. So, for instance, let's say you want to use Peten to Xyz summon. Now, well, not Xyz summon, let's say fusion summoning, right? So, let's say there's a fusion card that uses Peten, right? So you use Peten as a fusion summon. All right, cool. Well, when you fusion summon something, you send the materials to the graveyard, and then you summon the monster. So you would assume that because Peten went to the graveyard, his effect can go off. No, it's because in the act of fusion summoning, you sent them to the graveyard, then in the same step, summoned the monster. That was the last thing that happened, and because Peten's effect is time sensitive, we are already past the point. In one step, we have already gone past the point where his effect can go off, which makes it much harder to use his effect. Perform Age would not have this issue because it just says if. It could be any time afterwards. Anytime afterwards. That, like, you have to seriously have like a solid grasp of and an eye for these different kinds of clauses and grammar. Except this whole time, I've actually been lying to you because there's actually a case where a when clause will never miss timing, and that is with a card like Zaborg the Thunder Monarch. So you're like, well, what's the difference between these two? Peten says when something happens, and Zaborg says, when something happens, when this card is tribute summoned. You can use its effect. It's about it's about what's after the condition. See, Petens says you can banish this card. You can use its effect if you meet the condition. Zaborg just says do it. It just says when this card is tribute summoned, target a monster on the field, destroy the target. Zaborg's ability is considered a mandatory effect. So despite the fact that they both use the same, like, when, Peten says that you can, therefore you need an opportunity to actually do it. You need a space, essentially, where you can fit that action in. Zaborg's does not need that. It will happen regardless. This is a goddamn mess. What the fuck? So how do we fix this? Well, if we go back to our example from earlier, Magic the Gathering opts to condense common effects into keywords. Other games do this, but we're going to use Magic as an example because it's the most well known. Now, this could be a promising avenue, but it doesn't account for all the intricacies of Yu-Gi-Oh! There's so many different states that a card can be in: face up, face down, attack, defense position. And that's for every single monster card. Spell cards can be face up, face down. There's lots of, like, just little edge cases and things. Does something target? Is it non-targeting? So we're going to need something a little more broad. Which brings me to Taigen's Yu-Gi-Oh! Keyword Solution, aka Taigox. So, what is Taigox? Well, it's my attempt to create a new system for writing Yu-Gi-Oh! Card text. It involves sweeping changes and is basically a complete overhaul of what the current system is. My main goal in developing this was to slim down the card text while also making it retaining the original meaning of them, but specifically to make it more efficient and clear. One of the main problems I've identified is redundancy. There's a lot of word count spent in Yu-Gi-Oh! Just writing out the same not even effects, but things like conditions and specifications that just recur over and over and over again across so many cards, and there's so many words spent on it. So this was influenced by the way that I read Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards. So let's go back to Perform Age Trick Clown. Now, when I look at Perform Age Trick Clown, a card I've never seen before, what I instantly do is I read the text, I skim it, and then I basically break it down into bullet points. So when I read Perform Age Trick Clown, I read, if sent to the graveyard, target a Perform Age monster in graveyard, special summon it, attack defense, take 1,000 damage, and it's a hard once per turn. Okay. And then all that basically gets compartmentalized into my mind, and that's a skill I've had to build up over a long time of reading Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards. So the first big change that I wanted to make was that effect text is now preceded by symbols indicating how the effect is activated. I'll quickly go over them on the right. So these are all kind of just stand-ins because I need a way to write it out in, like, a document. So these are all using emojis. I imagine there would be, specific symbols or something. But I want the basic idea, I think, of these. I think is solid. So an exclamation point is just a generic icon for an activated effect, what we would call an ignition effect by default, and this includes optional effects. Or, well, it generally would refer to an optional effect. An exclamation mark with a, like, parentheses question mark after it is an activated trigger effect. Essentially, an effect that requires a condition. It's a question mark because it is asking for a condition. And I've separated them into the red and white. I just imagine there would just be two colors of them. And that basically differentiates between an if and when clause, and specifically a you can, an optional thing. The exclamation point signifies that it's an optional effect, an activated ignition effect. The exclamation point plus this little kind of upwards curving arrow is a flip effect. I think it's pretty intuitive. Same thing, but with a lightning bolt would be a quick effect. And I have a lightning bolt here, just like a little lightning bolt emoji. But I would, if this, in the world where this is implemented, I would imagine that this would be the same icon that is used on quick play spell cards, because one of my goals, so on the left here, I chose these symbols to be intuitive and pull from other parts of the game. So there's no need to have two different lightning bolt icons. Who the fuck is yelling over there? It would be weird if you had two different lightning bolt symbols for what's basically an effect that works the same way. Similarly, I have an icon down here for a continuous effect. I just used an infinity symbol, but this would be the same one that would be used on like a continuous trap or spell card. And then just the so the question mark with this little kind of backwards looping arrow means that the following effect only activates if the previous effect resolved, basically an and if you do clause. One of the most, I think, useful things for like slimming down and making a lot of the text more clear. And finally, the question marks just by themselves are basically just a standalone if clause, no optional activated thing, it just happens. The second big change is, as the title of the system would imply, keywords. So I have a huge list. There's a document that I will link below that has basically a guide to all of the keywords and shorthand that I came up with. This is just a kind of short list. You can see them on the left right here. So I wanted to, when I was coming up with these, my main influences were to try and make it simple and rely a lot on like community lingo, or things that are very like common across different card games. So for instance, search just means to add a particular card from the deck to your hand. Obviously, you know, there you can get more specific. Search a terraforming would be like search a field spell, something like that. Rebirth, Reborn would just be target a monster in your graveyard and special summon it to the field. If you wanted to be more specific, you could say like rebirth a target in any like rebirth from any graveyard or something like that. I think it would be you would have to make these terms kind of flexible and be able to kind of tack things on to the end, because again, there's so many different nuances of how effects can work in Yu-Gi-Oh! That one in particular, and one a little like 2 entries later on the list, Barry, was also inspired by well-known cards. So for instance, obviously Barry, inspired by Foolish Burial. So I think it makes sense to say, oh, well, and any effect that sends cards from the deck to the graveyard would be burying it. And then just kind of like codifying things that are already very commonly used in the game, like negate or discard or destroy, but just kind of giving them solid definitions and just kind of incorporating them into the system. So for that purposes, discard always means sending a card from the hand to the graveyard. Destroying always means sending it from the field to the graveyard, and things like that. The assumption being when you discard, it's from your hand to your graveyard. Again, you could be more specific if you'd like in card text, like discard it to, I don't know, the opponent's graveyard. You could say discard to the opponent's graveyard or something like that. Try to be flexible with it. The last example I used here was like detach X, and so that's something that I also think is useful that other games will do, is they will have a variable number that is based off of whatever. So here, detach X. That would be for detaching a material from an Xyz monster, because there is Xyz monsters are some of the worst offenders in terms of just like bloat and text debt, because pretty much all of them use the mechanic of detaching materials to use an ability, but they have to write it out every single time, and it's so unnecessary that I think it would be much easier and more effective to just write detach detach plus a number, detach 1 for most cases, detach a material from an Xyz monster where X equals the amount of materials needed to activate the effect. So to go over some of the benefits of keywords in action, I want to talk about a notoriously very wordy card, Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. So the original card text reads, cannot be destroyed by card effects. Neither player can target this card with card effects. During your main phase, you can destroy one monster your opponent controls, and if you do, inflict damage to your opponent equal to that monster's original attack. You can use this effect a number of times per turn, up to the number of normal monsters used as fusion material for this card. Once per turn, when a card or effect is activated, quick effect, you can discard one card, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card, and if you do that, this card gains 1000 attack. Jesus. So how would I rewrite that using Tygox? Well, it would be like this. So right off the bat in the first line, I have condensed the first two sentences of the original card text into just simple keywords because they're just protections and protections that are, excuse me, somewhat common to the game. Absolute means that it can't be destroyed by card effects, and invisible means that neither player can target it with card effects. If you wanted to make it untargetable by only the opponent, for instance, you would just it would be written like invisible to opponent. Here it's for both players, so it gets to be even shorter. But onto the main effect text, you can see immediately all this huge block, this huge wall, is only really two effects. And they have like multiple layers to them, but it's only really two effects. So it would just be written as exclamation mark, so you know that it's an activated ability during the main phase. Destroy one monster your opponent controls. You can activate this as many times as normal monster materials were used to fusion summon this card. So again, a little wordy, but that's just kind of the way that the card works. It's a unique part of the card. I guess you could potentially come up with a keyword for things based off of how many materials were used, but it seems like a lot. And I don't know how many cards that would really apply to. And then following that, if that effect resolves by the exclamation mark plus the a little backwards arrow, deal damage to the opponent equal to that monster's original attack. So there, that's one chunk. And then the second chunk, this is an active ability, and it's a when clause. When a card or effect is activated, you can't quick effect, so for the lightning bolt, discard one, negate activation, and this is exhausting. So this is another thing that I've decided to make simpler. Exhausting means it's a soft once per turn, as in the card itself is exhausted by using the ability. That's kind of the idea. For instance, a hard once per turn would be called lockout, because lockout, it's locked out of using that ability. You're locked out of using that ability. But a soft once per turn, it's just called exhausting. So in just this one line, we've taken all that and we just basically trimmed it down to hey, this is an active ability. There's a condition on it. Here's what the condition is. A card or effect is activated. Then once that's fulfilled, you have this quick effect text. Okay, discard one, negate the activation. And then you have this stuff following it. If you do, destroy it. And if you do that, it gains 1000 attack. These don't have exclamation marks afterwards. For instance, one of these, if destroy it was like you can destroy it, if it was an optional effect, it would be like exclamation mark parentheses parentheses question mark, I guess parentheses backwards arrow. It gets a little convoluted. But hey, if you're gonna write effects that are that convoluted, then I guess you're asking for it. It's hard to completely simplify stuff in this game. So that's how I would rewrite it. And in that example, we have gone from 104 words to 66. And honestly, I think that the version with rewritten with Tygox is much easier to understand, if not just for the fact that the information is separated in such a clearer way than the original. Here's a simpler example from two cards we saw before, two classic cards with very simple effects. Foolish Burial, send one monster from your deck to the graveyard. This would just be rewritten as bury one monster. Monster Reborn, target a monster in either graveyard, special summon it, would just be rebirth a monster from either graveyard. Technically, you know, we are trimming some text off of it, but not really a substantial amount. And part of the point of showing this is that even cards with the simplest effects, this is at worst a neutral change. It doesn't really make the card any worse. It's just rewriting it so that it has this new keyword type of system in it. So with the simplest effects, I think that it has a negligible effect at worst, again. And with the more complex ones, as we're going to see in a moment, it has a huge effect in terms of streamlining the card. So here's another slightly more complex one, Call of the Haunted. So activate this card by targeting a monster in your graveyard, special summon that target in an attack position. When this card leaves the field, destroy that monster. When that monster is destroyed, destroy this card. So I would just rewrite this as rebirth one monster in attack position. That whole first sentence into rebirth one monster in attack position. And then you have two conditions. And because these are just the question marks by themselves, you know that they are not optional. They just happen. And I think this is actually even a slight improvement over a card that was already pretty simple, because you get to see when it's laid out like this, you get to see that these are basically the same effect, just covering both ends. The intent of it is that you summon you flip this over, you resurrect one of your monsters from the graveyard, and then if either that monster or Call the Haunted is destroyed, both die. So this is just laying that out in, I think, an even slightly clearer way, because you can just see one on top of the other. And we have trimmed it from a monstrous 34 words to 23. Okay, so much more complex. I think Xyz monsters are some of the ones that could benefit the most from this. We have number 38, Hope, Harbinger, Dragon, Titanic, Galaxy. With all this, I'm not even going to read that, but I'm going to show you how I would rewrite it. So again, pretty complex. It has 3 different effects, but I think with this, that's made much more clear. The fact that every single one is preceded by an icon, and that they're kind of also separated by line breaks. So this is something that it's actually done in the OCG, which is the Asian version of the card game, where they will actually on card text, if it has multiple different effects, separate it or number them, so like 1, 2, and 3 on the text, which I don't know why we don't do that. It might be because it makes it even harder. Japanese tends to be a much more compact language in some cases. But I think that this accomplishes a similar thing. So all this would be rewritten as is it's 3 different effects. The first one, activated effect. It's a when clause. So when a spell card or effect is activated on the field, you can do this. So it's a quick effect. Negate that activation. This is a soft once per turn. Now, if you do that, you can attach the card or the spell card to this monster. Attach it. Attach is the opposite of detach. You're attaching a material to it. The second effect is activated with the same sorts of conditions, same in that this is an active when clause. So when the opponent's monster declares an attack, that is all the text immediately following it, that's the condition. You can detach one, so detach one material. Change the attack target to this card, perform damage calculation. And then the final one, and this one's like a little wordy, so it's kind of, you can't really get around that. But this is an activated effect. It's an if clause. Face up monster, Xyz monster or monsters you control is destroyed by battle or card effect. So if that's the condition, and then you can Target one face-up Xyz monster you control against attack equal to one of those destroyed monsters' original attack. So a lot of this is actually just taking the original text of the card and just trimming out a lot of the redundant text. So this is going from 95 words to 72. On average, you can get, from a lot of these longer cards, you can get like 10 to 20 words shaved off without losing, I don't think, without really losing any meaning. It's like all of these things like once per turn, and if you do, when you can, if another, you can target a, well, I think that's still in there. Just like lots of just little words that you can take off, like basically like editing, just editing card text to slim it down. So here are the upsides to this system. The number one that I see is that it dramatically cuts down the amount of words per card. And by condensing long phrases into these simple symbols and terms, and that overall ends up making the card text less cluttered. So much easier to break down what multiple effects are and how they're activated. It also clearly separates elements that are confusing with the current system. When I say elements, I'm talking about mechanics like, or like, weird rules, things like soft and hard once per turn, as well as different clauses and contractions now being represented with symbols. Just overall makes it way easier and less headache-inducing to go about playing the game itself, or even understanding new cards that are coming out, and I think compartmentalize important things about cards. Oftentimes a card will have an effect that's a tiny little effect that's like one line of text, and it's sandwiched between multiple just huge blocks. But that one little effect could be the one that's actually important, and this makes it easier to discern that, to parse through the information. So there are some possible criticisms that I foresee. So one is that one that Konami has actually made in the past. So I think back in 2011, Konami put out a blog or something about why Yu-Gi-Oh! Has never adopted something like a keyword system. And what they called it was basically, they said that geek speak could be intimidating for new players. So like I said, too much jargon. Too many game-specific terms can be overwhelming for new players, and they might get turned off from it. It might scare them away. I would argue against this. Yes, it's overwhelming at first. Every card game, when you start learning it, especially if it's nothing like you've played before, is going to be very overwhelming. Card games inherently have a lot of mechanics going on, or they will at least grow to have a lot of mechanics going on. Card games tend to be very complex. Lots of complex interactions. And designs that are meant to make you make interesting decisions, so they have to make the playing ground really varied. However, it becomes way more natural, I think, as time goes on, which if you'll talk to people who, play, or if you yourself have played a game that uses keywords, yeah, it's a lot to like, what is that? What is that again? What is that? But once you have enough experience in the game, this big, scary learning curve only exists at like the very start. It only exists at the very start, and it helps definitely to have like simpler mechanics and simpler decks and things like that going on, which maybe Yu-Gi-Oh! Could also stand to have. But the learning curve is only going to be at the front of like, okay, what do these symbols mean? What are most of these keywords? But as time goes on, as you become more of an intermediate or an advanced player, you just get more experienced reading cards. It becomes very quickly like a second language. You immediately know how a card works just by looking at 3 words, even, and I think that's one of the great long-term strengths of this kind of a system. Another criticism I could see is that it doesn't cover all situations for a card, or for possible cards. And that is very true. I tried to allow for wiggle room. For instance, I mentioned like how you might want to write like invisible to opponent. But I am fully willing to admit that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a very complex game. and I probably have not accounted for everything. I can even see like maybe problems in certain contractions of like with adapting certain contractions into Tygox that I might not have done too great of a job. But even that stuff I think could be fixed with just kind of codifying maybe specific who knows punctuation or something like that to separate certain effects if they take place at different times or at the same time. Who knows? It's not a perfect system. It's just what I've come up in my room. But I think that for the most part, it is pretty good. And I'm also, if you have other things that I have missed or that you think are weaknesses in this, I would recommend. I would highly. I would love to hear your feedback. So, with all that being said, uh, let's be real. Konami is not going to adopt this. So what's even the point? Like they're not going to see this video. They're not going to rewrite all the card text to match this system that I just came up with, some random guy. Uh, I doubt online simulators are going to be, like fan run simulators are going to be doing the same. So why did I even do it? It was fun. I had a lot of fun. I genuinely had a lot of fun, and it's interesting food for thought and a thought experiment of perhaps how you could design something better, I guess. Like I had a ton of fun, literally just sitting in my room and rewriting card text for hours. I spent an entire evening doing it. It was really enjoyable. And in that vein, let's do some more rewrites just for fun. So the rest of this is going to be talking about how I rewrite different cards. So go back to our friend from the beginning, Cyber's Clock Dragon. Oh, what's all this? I would rewrite this as simply, okay, immediately 3 different effects that you can see. So the first effect has a condition. So when it's fusion summoned, you can bury X cards, where X equals the total link rating of the card's fusion materials, from the top of your deck. Again, kind of confusing, but that's how they designed it initially. Not too much I can do with that. And if you do that, your other monsters can't attack until the end of the turn, and this card gains 1,000 attack for each card you buried. Second effect, and this is a continuous one, so it just triggers. There's no active ability. It just occurs. If the conditions are met that you control a link monster, your other monsters gain fearsome, meaning that they can't be targeted for attacks, and invisible to opponent. And then the final one is that if this card was fusion summoned, you can fusion summoned and destroyed by an opponent's card effect. You can search one spell. I would consider like maybe like I'll sometimes get confused. That is one thing. Maybe I could like if there's multiple conditions, like this card has to be fusion summoned and it has to be destroyed by an opponent's card effect. Maybe I could just not write like a comma there because it makes me think that the effect follows it. But yeah, that's basically it. So I think overall way more concise and easy to understand. Second one, oh yeah, we've got 125 words to 69. Way better in my opinion, with still preserving the original meaning. I feel like outside of like one thing, like I just said, pretty understandable. Endymion, the mighty master of magic. Jesus. Okay. So this is how I would rewrite it. And again, it's really long, but that's because there's just so much going on in the card. This is the best that I could do. I've tried to separate them. The ones with the little like double carrots, I've kind of bracketed. That first section is all the pendulum effect, everything that's in brackets is the monster effect. So let's start with the pendulum effect, or the spell effect. So this was another thing because I realized that this was a very common mechanic, especially in certain archetypes, of manipulating counters. So I came up with this. It's a little weird looking, but it's essentially parentheses discharge X. Or charge X for the opposite. Essentially what it means is that in parentheses, that's the type of counter, in this case spells, so spell counters. Discharge means that you take them off, and 6 is how many you take off. So you discharge 6 spell counters. That's how you would read this. You can special summon this card from the Pendulum Zone. destroy up to X cards, where X is equal to your cards that can have spell counters. It's so weird. And then if you do that, then you can do the opposite of discharging. You can add spell counters. You can charge spell counters, where X equal to monsters destroyed to itself. And this is a hard once per turn to lockout effect. So again, yeah, a lot going on, a lot of like little nuanced things, but I think a lot easier to conceptualize than the original, just like a lot friendlier than the original wall of text. And speaking of, the monster effect, which is even more confusing. So not only do we have, not confusing, but even more dense. So not only do we have 3 separate effects, one of them has like 4 different possible steps. So the original is an activated effect if, when a spell / trap card or effect is activated. Condition, quick effect, you can bounce being send a card from the field to the hand. Like bouncing, again, that's like a colloquial term. Bounce one of your cards with a spell counter. This is a soft once per turn. If you do that, you can negate the activation of that spell trap card. If you do that, you can destroy it. If you do that, destroy it. These are not optionals. And then you can, again, this is what I was talking about. Destroy it. So this is so weird. Destroying it and adding spell counters based off of whatever card you bounced to itself. It's such a complex effect. Those are part of like this. Those are part of the same thing. That's not like a separate. That's part of a separate effect. Sorry, not part of a separate effect. So, but it is an optional part of the ability. That's the whole first one, and the other 2 are relatively simple compared to it. One is just a continuous one, so you don't have to activate it or anything. While it has a spell counter, it gains invisible to opponent and absolute to the opponent, so can't be targeted, can't be destroyed by your opponent via spell effects, card effects. And then finally, when it has a spell counter and is destroyed by battle, you could just search one normal spell. So yeah, a lot of text. Lot going on, and I counted the word count, so 108 words to 98. Not the most huge, culling, but there's a lot of unique stuff going on in this card, a lot of very specific, intricate things. So it's just kind of hard. I think the fact that I could get it down like 10 words less is actually kind of impressive, and I think for that it is much easier to actually understand the way that it works. With the original, you just have to like read and read and read, and keep in mind that this is all the same effect. I think with this, my version, you can just see the way that each step kind of follows the previous one and what you actually have to think about and worry about, basically. And then I think finally, Nibiru, the primal being. I really liked doing this one for some reason. So again, a lot of text, but its effect actually isn't that crazy. So basically, it's an activated effect. It's an if clause. If during your main phase, the opponent normal or special summons 5+ monsters this turn, so they flood the whole board. Quick effect. You contribute as many face-up monsters on the field as possible, and then if you do that, you can special summon this card from your hand. Yeah, no, it's not a can. It's not you just do it. Special summon it from your hand, then summon one primal being token, and then it has all the details, rock, light, yada yada, and then to basically summon the token effect. This token's attack defense becomes the combined of the attributed monsters. Lockout, hard once per turn. So a lot of things going on, and but I think when you look at the original, like if you look at the original compared to Endymion, they kind of have a similar amount of text. So this is 87 words. So Endymion's a little longer, but if you take out the pendulum stuff, let's look at the monster text on Endymion, and you look at Nibiru, not too far off. I trimmed that down to 66, but you can tell just from at a glance, if you just look at the Tygox rewrites of both of these, These work in totally different ways, and one of them, Nibiru, actually isn't that complicated. Basically, oh, okay, I can read this. All right, it's basically got one thing going on. All right, so during the main phase, if they flood the board, I contribute as many face-up monsters as I want. I summon Primal Being Nibiru, and then I summon a token to their side of the field. And then there's all these details about what the token is. So I think this actually does a better job of communicating the different ways that both of these cards work and how they're like designed. I think that like looking at this makes it much less intimidating than just the original card text. And that's kind of one of the goals of this, even if there is a lot of jargon, in these keywords. Actually, there's only really one, just lockout on this, and the use of symbols. I think that using a system like this is much more preferable to the one that is in use now. Again, I don't expect any kind of change. I don't expect this to be adopted by anyone. But hey, if you are developing a card game, maybe, and you're thinking about maybe different ways that you can write down card text or card effects, maybe this could be some good food for thought. I'd be very welcome. I'd love to know what anyone who watches this thinks, any feedback on it. I think this is also going to be the first video on my new second channel, which is actually the fourth channel I've made. So thank you for checking this out. And thank you for watching. Yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say. This was fun. Bye.